Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, you might have noticed since we've been doing this show, nearly 2 years now, that we very rarely have politicians on, and there's a very good reason for that. Most of them are very predictable and indeed boring, and they certainly don't implant themselves in the public mind and imagination. Well, you certainly can't say that about my guest this morning. Ann Widdecombe entered Parliament in 1987. She rose to become Shadow Home Secretary. She left Parliament in 2010 and after a bit of a break came back and became an MEP for the Brexit Party, and in between times became something of a bona fide TV star with appearances ranging from Strictly Come Dancing right to Celebrity Big Brother. And thank you very, very much for joining us this morning.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
And I have to say, before we go on, that's a pretty impressive library you've got there. What is it?
Those are Hansards that you can see behind me. That is the verbatim record of every word that is said in Parliament, that is in the chamber.
Yeah.
Every word that is said throughout the course of a parliamentary year. And so I've got every single thing here from the moment I entered Parliament in 1987 to the moment I left in 2010. And so if anybody writes to me and says, oh, but you said, or you voted, or you did this, or you did that, I can check it out, just
Right.
as I can also check out, anything from the history of those years.
Do they still produce it actually in hard copy?
I suspect not. I mean, obviously my entitlement to it ended when I left Parliament. But I suspect that these days it's probably all done remotely.
Yeah.
And people don't have rather splendid libraries like this. The Lords used to get exactly the same. Theirs were read.
Yes. We have to start really with the subject of Brexit because obviously time, the clock is running down yet again. I wondered, Nigel Farage recently said that he thought Brexit was in more peril, in fact, than he could remember in the past year. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think Brexit has always been in peril. But I think Nigel's observation is based on the fact that there's precious little time left now. And I think most observers are expecting a sellout, because the fact is that if Boris was serious about leaving the talks if they weren't making progress, he would have left at the end of June and we would have had a deal by now, because that would have signalled to the EU that we were deadly serious. And we were only going to negotiate as a sovereign nation, not as some sort of semi-detached member of the EU.
Yeah.
He didn't walk out at the end of June. He didn't walk out at the end of July. He didn't walk out on the 15th of October. Let's face it, he ain't going to walk out. And the time now for British business to get ready for an Australia-style deal is now so short that he will be able to argue it's no longer feasible and it's all due to COVID and it's nothing to do with his own lack of will. And so I suspect any true Brexit is now very seriously in peril because the deadline's looming. There's no real side. There's much talk. I'll always grant Boris, he does a lot of talking, but there's no evidence of real action.
What about what's happened in America? I mean, what difference do you think that will make? I mean, we're hearing a lot of press comment about it, but what's your view on that?
I think it's going to make a big difference. The fact is Biden is anti-Brexit and believed it was his business to say so at the time. But far more dangerous than that, Biden is very clear about the situation in Ireland, about what he wants to see. He doesn't care if there's a border down the Irish Sea. So what he's effectively talking about, although he would never phrase it in such a way, is the breakup of the UK. So I think that we are in quite a serious situation. But on the other hand, we have a special military relationship with the States. We've been for years the only country that has paid its full whack of NATO. I think they know that we are pretty essential to them. But nevertheless, whereas Trump was pro-Brexit, pro an independent Britain, wanted a United Kingdom, Biden's the opposite. So it could be dangerous. But on the other hand, if a deal or probably a surrender. But if something is done by the end of the year, it will be a fait accompli. And Biden doesn't become president until January.
When you think back to 2016 and the referendum, I mean, would you have thought that you and I would be sitting here now talking about the possibility of not having a Brexit?
I would have been appalled, and I wouldn't have thought it. No, that is not what I predicted. All the parliamentary leaders were saying they were going to abide by the result of the referendum because they all expected it to go the other way. When most inconveniently for them, it did not go the sort of metropolitan elite way at all. Then I think we would have had a series of excuses anyway, but Theresa May and her appalling leadership and the loss of the parliamentary majority, which meant effectively that even if she'd had the will to do it, she was too hampered by Parliament to be able to effect a proper Brexit. All that has conspired to this very, very prolonged timetable. I mean, we have left the EU, but if we're in any way kept bound by their rules or bound by their justice, by their courts, then we haven't actually left in any meaningful way. And my fear throughout has been a half Brexit.
Would you go along with the view that simply that the establishment, for want of a better word, simply just was determined that whatever happened, we wouldn't really leave. We might leave in word, but not in spirit. I mean, do you go along with that, or do you think it's purely political incompetence?
Oh, I think it's a mix. I mean, I think there was an initial reluctance to accept the fact this was really going to happen. We were going to leave. I think there was that reluctance. But I also think it was largely incompetence. I mean, if Theresa May had had the sort of majority that Boris has got and had been genuinely committed to Brexit, which I think there's a very big question mark over that, but if she'd been genuinely committed to Brexit with a strong parliamentary majority, then it could have been carried through. The fact is she wasn't that committed and she didn't have a strong parliamentary majority. So it's been a mixture of incompetence, lack of will, and yes, some part resistance, but not, I think, a great deal. I think when we left on the 31st of January, there was then, even if with a sigh and a raising of eyebrows, I think there was then a general acceptance by the establishment we're going. And wiser heads said, or rather we've gone, wiser heads said, OK, if this now is really the situation, time to accept it and to make sure we get a good deal for Britain. And everybody should have been united around that. But I'm afraid there are still elements that hope that one day, we'll reapply to join, and therefore that the closer we stay to them now, the better. And that view is around.
When you look at the government now, here we are with the government's got an 80-seat majority. It appears to be frittering it away, or at least not using it. What do you know Boris Johnson? What's your view of him? Did you know him personally?
I don't know Boris Johnson personally, not in terms of, social friendship. Of course, we overlapped in Parliament. I had plenty of time to observe him as a member of Parliament. I can remember his performances on one particular committee, which I chaired, which were very funny, but not necessarily terribly deep. And I think the problem with Boris is he is chaotic. And he is utterly reliant on people around him to keep everything on the road, to keep the show on the road, to keep him where he ought to be at what time he ought to be there. He is chaotic. Now, I think he is genuinely pro-Brexit. I certainly think that at heart, he is still a libertarian. But he's been captured, basically. He's been captured. And I think COVID has thrown him completely. But also COVID is, of course, a very good excuse for those who didn't particularly want to get on with it. And now I think he's in a weak position. When he came in, he said, right, everybody who stood as a Conservative MP was signed up to keeping no deal on the table. He had the big majority. His slogan through the campaign had been get Brexit done. The people had spoken yet again.
Yes.
And I think that if he'd gone in with that sort of will then and said, right, this is it, Brexit, we're leaving at the end of June if there's no proper progress, We have red lines. We're not departing from those red lines. We're a sovereign state. We control our own waters. Of course, you can fish in them, but only to the extent that we actually say so, because we are a sovereign state. Mm-hmm. No, we're not going to be governed by your rules on state aid because we are a sovereign state. If he'd taken that line and really stuck to it, Parliament, I think, or certainly the Conservative Party in Parliament, would have been behind him because he would have been delivering on what he promised.
Yes.
But he's gone from Tigger to Eeyore, and his whole management of COVID, which of course has a read across to everything else because his MPs are looking to him for leadership. If he's not giving it on COVID, then they won't be following him on other things. And his whole management of COVID has been flip-flop. One day a lockdown is not in the national interest, the next day a lockdown is. And most people in this country probably haven't a clue what the rules are at the moment, because they've changed every day. Yeah. Prime Minister's got it wrong occasionally, Chief Constables have got it wrong. Changes every day. It hasn't been strong, firm leadership in the face of adversity. It has been timid.
Absolutely. Do you go along? There is this view that around about March, just before the first lockdown, that in fact there was a tremendous loss of nerve. That in fact Boris's instinct was not to go with the lockdown. There's that view, and then there's the other view that in fact he was just personally affected by having COVID. I mean, do you sort of line up with one or other of those views?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I mean, he was obviously very bad hit. I mean, COVID nearly killed him. I mean, let's not forget that he was in hospital and at one stage it looked very much in the balance. We tend to forget that. We tend to think, oh, he's had COVID, but he had it phenomenally badly. And I think that did affect him. Maybe it has affected subsequent decisions, but I doubt it. I think it's just weakened him further, combined with a brand new baby and a wife who was demanding that he and a fiance who was demanding that he change the nappies. And he had an awful lot altogether. And a strong person, a Churchill, would have just gone through that and would have said, right, what's important? Yeah. I think one of the most important things to say about Boris and lockdown is the option was never just let it rip. This is the nation that came through the Blitz. We didn't say just let the bombs drop. We had air raid warnings. We had air raid shelters. We had blackout blinds and would you be fined if you saw an even chink of light. We had a civilian force to watch the fires. We did all that we could. We took all the precautions that we could, but we didn't give in. And that has been very much the line that other countries like Sweden have taken, for example. They didn't just say, let it rip. They've taken a lot of precautions, but they didn't actually give in, crash the economy and stop everything in its tracks, because that doesn't work. It just starts again. And we cannot go on just stop starting. Now, my view, and I said this in March, so I cannot be accused of hindsight. My view, clearly expressed in my Daily Express column, very good one, by the way, every Wednesday. Right. My view as expressed then was, look, 90%, it's now 95, but then we thought 90% of all those who died were either in advanced old age or they already had underlying health conditions. In other words, they were weakened in one way or the other. So my line always was, they're the people we've got to protect, lock them down, tell everybody else it's their duty to keep the economy going, and then, for heaven's sake, concentrate on how we support those people, because you can't just lock them down and forget them. How we make it possible for some socialisation, how we make it possible for family contact. We didn't ask those questions because we were too busy taking a blanket approach.
Yes. Do you also feel strongly about loss of civil liberties? Are you one of the people that actually is looking at this and is appalled at the way in which freedoms have been curtailed?
I don't think that is the end game. I mean, I absolutely reject that, if you like, the conspiracy theory that really, this is a totalitarian government and they're just softening us up. Don't agree with that at all. There has been a massive loss of civil liberty. There always is when there's a crisis of some sort. Government's got to say, you must do this, as long as it doesn't change its mind every 5 minutes. And I will accept that as long as it's very temporary. But as I say, I don't think on purely practical grounds that we needed to lose civil liberty to the extent that we have. And that's what I focus on. If I thought that lockdown was going to be highly effective and was the ultimate answer, I wouldn't be too worried about civil liberties. But I don't. And therefore, we shouldn't be losing those liberties. And when you're actually telling families, they've got to kneel down on the pavement to peer through railings to see their loved ones in care homes, we have gone completely bonkers. And we mustn't get into the habit of accepting diktat from government. But as I say, we wouldn't have had to lose those liberties in the first place if we'd had a more sensible approach.
Will you get involved in the new, as it were, the reformed Brexit Party called Reform? I mean, will you therefore be involved in that?
Well, the two big objectives of that party at the moment are to get a proper Brexit deal and to oppose a universal lockdown. And I support both those aims, as you know, would argue very strongly. And therefore, yes, at the moment, I am certainly supporting that new party. However, when Brexit is done, one way or the other, and when the vaccines have been implemented and lockdown is no longer an immediate problem, that time will come. If that party then concentrates on electoral reform, now, I believe in reducing the size of the House of Lords to half, actually. I believe in strongly reducing the size of the House of Commons. I would probably cut it by a third. But if there is any suggestion that I would ever sign up to a party which believed in abolishing first past the post, then I cannot do that. I believe most electoral systems are bad, but that is the best of a very bad bunch. Perpetual coalitions mean you don't get any direction. Right. You don't get any direction. And we don't need to be in that sort of stymied situation as we were throughout Theresa May's latter period, and as we have been in the past before. So I couldn't sign up to abolishing first past the post, but the other aims that they have, I'm with. And as I say, for the moment, it's about Brexit and lockdown, and they're the only people who are actually enunciating what I believe.
What does this mean? I mean, obviously, I'm with you on that on the lockdown bit, absolutely. We're hearing at the moment about Christmas, and actually the language in which it's discussed is that we are being allowed Christmas maybe, or, there's going to be an exchange, you go into lockdown in January and all of this stuff. What will you be doing at Christmas? I mean, will you sort of be abiding by the rules insofar as we even know what they are?
Well, that's a very good qualification if we do know what they are and if they're clear. The answer is I shall do what I have done throughout this, right back from March. And I have applied common sense, proportionality and humanity. And I have said throughout, I will do what I believe meets those criteria. So, for example, when I had been locked down for 14 days and hadn't seen a soul, other people who'd been locked down for 14 days and hadn't seen a soul, and therefore neither of us could give it to each other, I was perfectly prepared to get together with those people, and I did. They said, don't drive, only walk on exercise. I use the common sense up here. If I drive, I encounter nobody.
Yes, exactly.
If I walk, I pass people all the time. It is insane. So I have applied my own sense of proportionality, and I should be doing that at Christmas. And actually, I think this is one that Boris has got to accept. The British people won't be told what to do at Christmas, or at least most of them won't. Only the very timid will. And people will get together. I mean, you've had people like Bel Mooney saying it's 14 at her Christmas table. People will get together. And again, I use common sense. My family, if they meet en masse, and it doesn't always happen because they're all going to their own in-laws and all the rest of it. But if my family meets en masse, there are up to 12 of us. But hang on, those 12 who would be getting together have already got together in other mixes.
Yes.
So that my nephew's family, for example, will have already had my sister-in-law round for Christmas. So if they and she come to me, we've already mixed.
Yes.
So again, I apply proportionality, common sense. And that is what I would urge. I wouldn't urge people to say, let it rip, it doesn't matter, nothing's happening, it is happening. But say, I will apply common sense. What is the main criterion? That I don't give it to anybody else, and that as far as possible, I don't get it from anybody else. Where are the risks? And that's the question people have got to answer. And it isn't in meeting your family who've already all met each other anyway, and you happen to exceed the magic number.
And I would have thought as well, you're a person of considerable faith, aren't you?
Yes.
I would have thought that at Christmas time, well, not that you don't throughout the year, but that's the time when a lot of people go to church or they go to a service or something. Have you been disappointed in the general reaction of the church throughout this whole period? Because, we've had people on this channel who've been appalled, actually, at the way in which the church is more or less rolled over. Would you agree with that? Isn't this a time when people really need spiritual comfort?
I think the churches did roll over in the first lockdown. No doubt about that at all. They rolled over. This time, in the second lockdown, they've taken a different line. And there's a very good reason for that. It's that in between the lockdowns, they all worked out their systems to make sure that you had social distancing. I mean, I'm in a little country church. We have to sit with a pew's width between us. There's then an empty pew in front of us, and then the backs of the people at a pew's width ahead of that. You couldn't, if you tried, give anybody COVID. We're all in masks anyway. They've worked out a circular route to the communion so that you don't pass each other. And therefore, they have, and this is where common sense and proportionality comes in, they have met the criteria for trying to prevent the transmission of COVID. That is proper social distancing. They've met it. They've done it. We can do it. And most churches have managed that. And therefore, in the second lockdown, first of all, the Catholic bishops complained bitterly to the government, formal protest, and said it's unnecessary. Then the Anglicans did exactly the same. Government hasn't listened, of course, hasn't listened at all, hasn't even had the courtesy to listen. Now, I think Christmas services should go ahead.
Yeah.
And they should just go ahead. What are the police going to do? Go into every church and arrest all the priests on Christmas? Nonsense.
Well, no, maybe nonsense, but I'm afraid it's becoming more and more feasible, the idea of that. Has it been different? I mean, you're a member of the Catholic Church. Has it been different between the Catholic Church and the Church of England? It seems to me that the most supine has actually been the Church of England.
Well, it always is, of course. Church of England is always pretty supine. The Catholic Church, by its very nature, isn't, because it has a strong belief in, this is right and that's it. As I say, during the first lockdown, there was a great spirit of cooperation. But I live streamed the Mass from Westminster Cathedral. Great, big, cavernous Westminster Cathedral. You could easily have had a socially distanced congregation in there. Easily, easy peasy. And yet it wasn't done. I think that the churches need to get a bit more, in the right sense of the word, militant, not the wrong sense, but in the right sense of the word. We need the church militant back again. At least as a Catholic, I did get Westminster Cathedral. The Anglicans had to put up with Justin Welby in his kitchen.
Yes. Speaking of churches and free and wokeness and the rest of it, you recently wrote in your column in the Daily Express, very good column, out on Wednesdays, as you just said, you recently wrote about free speech. Now, in amongst COVID, something that has really preoccupied us here on this channel is these extraordinary cultural issues going on at the same time, right? Very big, I would say the most important ones. You were talking in the column about the attacks on free speech, in particular coming from the Law Commission. Can you explain a bit about that? Because a lot of people won't be familiar with what that was about, but this is really very worrying, is it not?
Oh, it's hugely worrying. And what is more worrying is that Boris didn't just say no at the outset. Just, we're not doing that. The proposal, in essence, is that the hate laws, that's laws which prevent homophobia and racism and sexism, that those laws, hate speech laws, should be applied to conversations in our own homes. That is the serious proposal. Now, an Englishman's home is his castle, and the one place we have been free to say anything we like has been. But in future, if this proposal were to get through Parliament, and God forbid that it should, in the future, we would actually be answerable to the state for what we say in our own homes. Now, that is where the word totalitarian is not misapplied.
Yes, exactly.
Because the only type of state that ever seeks to control what an individual says and does in his own home, as long as it's not breaking some other law, like conspiring for an act of terrorism or something. The only states that have ever tried to impose that sort of uniformity are the Soviet Union and the Nazis, totalitarians.
Yes. It is extraordinary, as you say, that this has come from a respected body, the Law Commission. As you say, Boris has not actually even dismissed it out of hand. This general attack on free speech, this general cult of woke, it has seemingly intensified over this whole period of COVID. Do you take this as seriously as I do? And I mean, it seems to have captured virtually all of our institutions.
Yes, I take it very seriously. I'd expected the opposite to happen if I'd been making predictions back in March.
Why was that? Why?
Well, I would have said, right, we're now faced with a real crisis. It's probably the biggest crisis since the Blitz. And people will have no patience at all with the whingers who are worried about sort of statues and things like that. They'll have no time for that, because they will say, look, we're talking about life itself. We're talking about our quality of life. We're talking about our way of life. We're talking about our elderly, vulnerable. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about sick children. This is serious. So go away. Stop talking about statues. It doesn't matter. That's what I expected to happen. The exact opposite has happened. Now, partly that was because of George Floyd. But the exact opposite has happened, and it seems that the woke agenda is more prevalent than ever. And there is an answer to it, which is that authority has just got to get used to standing up against it.
But how do they do that, Anne? How do they do that?
Look, when Oxford students say you've got to take down Rhodes's statue, their response should be get a life. Get a life. We've even today, I read in the press, there's even a movement amongst the students at Leicester to try and tear down the statue of Simon de Montfort. Now, arguably, he's the father of English democracy. The father of English democracy. But because in the 13th century, he was in favour, certainly didn't stand against slavery and held other views. And particularly in his case, because he was anti-Semitic. In the 13th century. Now, we've got to get a sense of perspective here. When you look at, say, Edward Colston's time, they still had hanging, drawing and quartering. And he was supposed to have developed an individual empathy that made him anti-slavery. Of course he wouldn't. Wasn't the culture of the time. And the idea that in the 13th century, people, particularly at a time when there had been the Crusades and where you did have tension between Christians and Jews, regrettable though that was, you can't say, I expect him to have taken a 21st century perspective, because he wouldn't have had it. He couldn't have had it. For heaven's sake, you think of the punishments that were inflicted on people in the 13th century, the barbarity of the military campaigns in the 13th century. You're talking about a completely different social time.
But the thing is, it's extraordinary that we're even having to say this, isn't it? I mean, something that would strike most people as being complete common sense, of course. It's extraordinary that we're even having to say this. I mean, do you think, I do, that really this is not just about slavery? Actually, slavery has been a way in. It's actually an attack really on British history and Britain's sense of itself.
Oh, of course it is. Of course it is, because Anti-slavery, if you like, is just the conduit.
Yeah.
The anti-Semitism of Simon de Montfort is the conduit. It's not the root problem. And that is why I say authority, from government to universities to local councils to the police, whoever it is, people who are in positions of authority should actually say, get a life, not bow down to it. Now, when you see the police standing there watching statues being torn down, wanton acts of vandalism, doing nothing about it, then you do start to wonder. So I think it isn't just the woke agenda. They've got freedom of speech, which I would defend. Let them say all those things. Let them contest all those things. Not against them saying it at all. But why on earth everybody else is expected to bow down to it? The cancel culture is rampant. I mean, people are afraid for their jobs. They're afraid for their livelihoods if they stand against this woke agenda. But of course, if enough of them did, there would be nothing the woke people could do. Because if everybody in entertainment is saying, well, sorry, just not going along with that, there's nothing they can do. So I feel very strongly that this isn't just about what is being done, it's about resistance.
But wouldn't it be good as well to hear a bit from the government? I mean, this is a Conservative government. Boris finally said something about statues, didn't he, after quite a long period.
Yeah.
But it would be nice, would it not, to actually hear the sort of words that we've heard from Macron, for example, about this?
I think it would be a very big start if Boris said tomorrow morning, we are not going to implement that proposal of the Law Commission. You certainly have free speech. You can think what you like. You can say within certain limits, because you certainly should never be allowed to stir up hatred or violence. I mean, I think we'd all agree that's wrong. But within certain limits, you can say what you like. And when you're at home and nobody can hear what you say, then it doesn't matter, because that is the way you develop thoughts. I mean, I have a mental scenario of you have a dinner party of friends. They all know you. They know what you think anyway. But one of them brings along an unexpected guest to the party. And that guest takes offence at ideas which are put forward. Now, that is an absolute lunacy. We already have laws saying you can't engage in criminal conspiracy at home any more than you can anywhere else. That's fine. I think we'd all agree with that. You can't engage in criminal conspiracy. Beyond that, you should be free to speak.
The crucial thing is, surely, as well, that with hate speech, which I know a fair amount about being in the London Assembly, because it's a big issue there, is that it requires no evidence. This is extraordinary, isn't it? It is entirely based on the person who decides that something is hate speech. And it doesn't even have to be the supposed victim. It can actually be anybody else. This is quite extraordinary, is it not?
It is. And as I observed in my Express column, very good column every Wednesday, in every other part of the law, intention plays a massive part. I mean, if you accidentally kill somebody, you're not going to be charged with murder because everybody accepts you didn't intend to do it. If I pick up somebody else's handbag and mistake for my own, even if I get all the way home before I've realised, nobody's going to prosecute me for theft because they understand that was a mistake. But you don't have to show intention when it comes to the laws on hate speech. It is enough for somebody else, and as you rightly say, it doesn't even have to be the victim in inverted commas. It is enough for somebody else to say, that is hate speech, for it to be assumed to be.
Yes.
And we need actually to get some really good libertarian law into this country. As I say, I don't want to silence anybody who's on the woke side of this. What I do want is for them to respect the fact that I won't be silenced either.
Speaking of which, I mean, you're not on Twitter, are you? And you don't do Twitter? No.
Absolutely not.
But you haven't been cancelled. Have you ever been no-platformed?
I certainly have. There was a terrific to-do in May 2019 when I was interviewed on the Sophie Ridge programme on Sky, and right at the end of it, they threw back at me an article that I'd written in 2012, which was about whether or not people who are gay could in the future possibly transition to not being so. And all I said on that programme was, and I never talked about gay cures and never said anything like that. What I said was, once we thought that if you were a man or a woman, that was it, final, end of story. Then science made it possible for people to transition between the two, and we've never stopped them doing that. And I just said, maybe some stage in the future, science will find it possible to enable a gay person to transition. Transition, not be cured. Cue uproar. I was then on a theatre tour all over the country, and some of those theatres cancelled on the basis of the uproar. And there were a few. The Lowther Pavilion, for example, up in Blackpool, went ahead. And as a result, had a huge attendance because people came in from neighbouring theatres which had actually cancelled. But yeah, I was cancelled, not even for something I've said, but for an interpretation that was put on what I had said. But I just carry on. Now, of course, I can carry on. I'm semi-retired anyway. I've got my column in the Daily Express. I wasn't going to be pushed into poverty if I couldn't perform in theatres. And of course, they got over it. And eventually I was performing again. But there are people who can lose their jobs, who can lose their livelihoods because they have said something. Sometimes something as simple as God bless to a patient who then takes offence can actually lose livelihoods, Now, this is completely wrong, and it is giving too much power to one side of the argument. I don't want the power to cancel anybody, however profoundly I may disagree with them. I don't want that sort of power.
You mentioned there that you're semi-retired, and you don't seem semi-retired, I have to say. What actually motivates you to keep going? I mean, you're pretty much always there. I mean, if you do end up being part of the new Reform Party, say, presumably you might, stand for something there.
Well, I don't think I shall stand for Parliament again, if that was what was behind your question.
Yeah.
I didn't really want to stand for Parliament last time at all. But what happened was that I thought, retired from politics at any rate. I'd been doing the reality shows, the TV quiz programs. I was going around the country doing funny speeches and theatre evenings and things. And I thought I'd retired from the serious life, if you like, other than my Express column. But then I became so outraged about the efforts to thwart Brexit and about the mess that Theresa May was making of it, about the complete, unbelievable stand of Jeremy Corbyn on a large range of issues. And I said at the time, we've got the worst Prime Minister since Anthony Eden. We've got the worst leader of the opposition in the entire history of the Labour Party. We've got the worst Parliament since Oliver Cromwell. And with that combination, we were engaging in the most important international negotiations for 50 years. So I got more and more outraged, and eventually I decided I would act upon the outrage rather than just yelling from the sidelines. So to my utter amazement, I could never have predicted it even a few weeks before it happened, I joined the Brexit Party and I stood for the European Parliament with the specific aim of achieving Brexit. I certainly never wanted to return to Westminster, but we had to put up a campaign. And there was no chance of winning once Nigel had decided that we weren't going to contest all the Tory seats. We obviously couldn't form a government. There was no chance that we would win. But nevertheless, it was important just to do the message, if you like, to put the message out. But I don't think that situation is going to arise again. That was a very specific situation. So I don't see myself standing for Parliament. But I will certainly campaign for things that I believe in. Brexit was one, anti-lockdown is another. I will campaign for those things.
Well, look, Anne, I'm sure, you're not going to drop from our screens anytime soon. But I was going to say thank you very much for giving us a lot of time this morning. Well, if I don't speak to you, which I'm sure I won't between now and then, very happy Christmas to you for when it comes. Thanks so much indeed, Anne. And hope to see you on the show maybe in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's
Thanks,
it.
Peter.
That's it for today on So What You're Saying Is. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, please remember, do subscribe, won't you? Thanks so much.